Welcome to the Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hazen. Coming up on today's episode, Jess Fuselier from the Sundance Institute's Creative Distribution Initiative. She's Manager of Research and Education, and with the Sundance Film Festival starting up this week, I wanted to have her on because she's got a very unique perspective and outlook on the future of indie distribution, and it's very vital to where independent filmmaking is going in general. But first up, what I watched this week, just recently I just saw Parasite for a third time, which that's fun. It just finally came to Evansville, and it was a good crowd, which we don't always get in Evansville, and that movie always works really well with the crowd every time I've seen it. And for the first time, I finally got what the last shot meant. The first two viewings, I didn't get that. Not so much theatrically. One of the most interesting things I saw this week was those first two episodes of The Outsider, which, I feel like I've had a few auteurist debates lately since the Scorsese brouhaha about Marvel. And this is one of those great examples of, Jason Bateman directed both episodes. I think he's probably directing all of them, and he's a pretty solid director. But this is a great example. The auteur theory doesn't always need to be 100% the way it's done, because when you have a writer-producer like Richard Price, man, it's just going to be a pure sign of quality and cinematic quality, and he's just such a great writer. He's such a great writer, both as a novelist and a screenwriter, and his TV output has the last few years, since The Wire in particular, has been phenomenal. The other thing I deep dived into, I've been meaning to get around to this for a while, is Lords of Flatbush. It was from, I want to say, 73 or 74. It was kind of coming around the time Happy Days was first coming out, and it's notable for having one of Sylvester Stallone's first big entrances to the American public. I became interested in after reading Quentin Tarantino on the New Beverly blog wrote a great essay about it. And if you haven't been checking out his essays on the New Beverly blog, for someone like me that's sad that he's going to retire, I'm also not as sad, just because I went to a few QT fests back in the day in Austin, and to hear him talk about any movie makes you instantly want to watch it. So knowing that he's going to start doing film criticism, I mean, I'm going to miss his movies, but it's clear he's going to be working in different mediums. But I'm really looking forward to his film criticism and the early stuff. He's written reviews for or essays about The Shootist, Big Wednesday, The Yakuza, Escape from Alcatraz, which, if I remember correctly, past guest Ted Haycraft thinks is one of the best things written about 70s action movies. And he's not disappointing on that. If you can, I highly recommend checking out Tarantino's writing on the New Beverly blog. But I should also mention that the Oscar nominations came out last week, and I don't care about going into the deep dive of who got what. It is sad and annoying to me how every year increasingly I just don't care about the Oscars. And maybe that's harsh, because what I'm looking for is actual, it's subjectivity. And it's a consensus, and it's, very short-sighted consensus. But I get frustrated by how, as film fans, we never rely on the Oscars for movies we're going to be interested in 10 years. And increasingly, I just don't remember who won the Oscar 5 years ago, and now it's getting to the point I don't remember who won the last 2 or 3 years, who the nominees were. You look at the lists, and you're just like, oh, that's not a good movie, and it's on there. And I mean, to a certain extent, the movies we are going to be interested in 10 years are the ones that right now are very divisive, and people feel strongly about. And what happens is the people who strongly dislike them, that's going to go to the wayside, and the people that feel strongly for them are going to continue that passion. And so, yeah, inherently, a lot of these top 10 lists, they serve a function, and it's fine. But the Oscars in particular, I find very annoying, just because if you're familiar with the Oscars origins, what it came down to was Louis Mayer was he was having a fight with what at the time was the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, which later became the MPAA. And it was this combination of him trying to find an alternate way of getting more sway over that with what they were doing with self-censorship. And it was a weird way of heading off organized labor. So it almost became like uh, a carrot to get below the line and above the line people to have a false sense of quality. And it's particularly at MGM, he wanted everyone. He wanted all the best stars there, and so he started this in 1926, I believe, and it was a dinner meeting that expanded out, and I think the first ceremony was 28, and which, yes, there's a very cynical reason why the Academy Awards were made. Shock of shockers. Um, but today, it just feels like it's the only reason studios are making mid-budget stuff. And then you have these really middle brow, uh, important ideas of what a movie should be, which you end up with biopics that have as much research as a Wikipedia article, and then you have actors doing a decent SNL performance impression that hopefully is a decent acting performance, and then they get nominated, and it's almost like it's the award is their justification for being in these like four quadrant soulless corporate stuff that they're trying to sell to China. And I just miss watching as a teenager and really actually thinking the Oscars meant something. And I don't know what replaces that anymore, but I don't know. Anyway. Jess Fuselier is on the show today. She works for Sundance, and not to double up on information that I'm going to talk about, or we're going to talk about in the interview. I knew Jess through her husband, Nicholas Gonda, who I had worked for previously, and Nick has always been he's always been very encouraging to me and to other of my friends about our desires to make our own films, writer, director, however. And he's not only been encouraging, but what's great is he's also been pragmatic and honest about it too, about what you need to set yourself out in the marketplace, and what realistically people or financiers and investors are really looking for. And so I always reach out to him with random ideas or random thoughts about trying to think out of the box. And with my move to the Midwest, which mainly is for cost of living, there's been a fear in the back of my head that I projected onto friends that I feel like I'm making a retreat from this goal of writing and directing movies. And it's weird just because I'm also having to rethink all that in general, just because, when I was a teenager, I convinced myself that movies were the best art form. They were the most empathetic art form. And I convinced myself that the best thing you could do is show another person your inner life, and make them empathize with that. And hopefully they can do the same, and we can all get along and figure each other out. And that was the reason I wanted to make movies. That was my logic that I stuck to for years. And midlife, cut to 20 years later, midlife crisis, there's just been a lot of rethinking that. And so trying to think out of the box, moving back to my hometown, but also trying to think of the positives. Regional filmmaking's made a giant rise. I wanted to use all the technical knowledge that I've gained working on these other movies in the last few years, and also just technology and distribution venues are getting better and better. Every phone shoots 4K, which 5 years ago that was gold to indie filmmakers. And sound is getting better. Listeners to this podcast may not agree with my sound recording chops, but the other thing was just that the pathway, which I thought was to get to write and direct your movies and have someone pay for them and make a career out of it, increasingly just does not. It's a very tiny bullseye to hit anymore. And trying to rethink what I want to do. What like Paul Schrader said last year or 2 years ago when First Reform was doing well, that being on the other side of a win, that feels like 4 or 5 films in the indie film market are picked to actually be successful at the end of the year, and there's the tastemakers and the gatekeepers can pick that, and then but there's more movies being made than ever, and in theory, yes, they're getting shown, but the trick also then, like, you have to separate: am I making movies to make movies to express and make art and engage with other people, or am I trying to make something that's good enough that people will keep paying me and I can keep food on the table? And or even not even just food on the table, like also like my increasingly, as you get older, your lifestyle includes more. I buy a house, I have kids. Like, you're just paying for that. It's why so many people go out to LA to be filmmakers, and they settle into craftsman roles because they get a mortgage. And so I've just been trying to think out of the box, and what it would mean to start making movies like I made when I was in college, and with that aforementioned newer technical knowledge, and just try to get back to the intrinsic fun and creativity of making movies, to make movies and put them out there. Just because I've lost all trust in or I have very little trust in certain movies getting out to the tastemakers. And I've always raved for years, although I haven't practiced what I preached about the democratic greatness of the internet, to at least put stuff out there, whether or not it's successful, and again, whether or not you can make a sustainable living off this, you can still put that out there. And that's kind of what this podcast is about, and just putting your own voice out, or putting my voice out there, and considering that it's worthwhile. Anyway, long preamble. Nick finally said, if you're talking about self-distribution, you should talk to my wife, Jess. And I've known Jess for years, and got her on the phone, and for like 45 minutes, and she answered so many of my questions, just because, in particular, it feels like the model is shrinking, and it would do us good to start looking at other venues if we're going to start putting our own or keeping our films out there. Because the thing about shrinking windows means that we're going to be shrinking ideas of whose stories can be told and whose stories are going to get out there. And there is a certain amount of democratization with more women and people of color, hopefully, their voices getting out there. But there also is this feeling that the people paying for them are the ones that decide what type of stories get made. And that is just a recipe for very stale stories, and or to expand the sophistication of the art form. Like, it's just not going to go anywhere with that. So oh, that was so freaking pretentious. So Jess was kind enough to tell me about how to make horror movies on an iPhone, and or in general, just what the future of if for someone like me, when I put out my own stuff and not have to go the route of a festival, what our possibilities lie, even if you're just willing to just make movies in anonymity. This is the future. So without further ado, Jess Fuselier. I'm trying to remember, when was the last time we saw each other? Was it was it at one of the Inheritance screenings?
Probably. It's been a minute. Was I there? I was at the Dances with Films screening.
I was not there. I was not there. I'm not sure if I've actually ever asked you this. Where are you from?
Austin.
Yo, you are from Austin. Okay.
Yep. I'm from Austin, born there, raised in the suburbs of Dallas, and then I got back to Austin as quick as I could following that. So. Okay.
Where'd you go to college?
I started out at Sarah Lawrence.
Okay, nice.
Which I loved, and then I transferred because of how expensive New York is and how expensive colleges like Sarah Lawrence are. I transferred back I transferred to University of Texas, just because I could get the in-state tuition and it was a little bit easier on the pocket.
Okay.
And so yeah, I finished out there. So technically my degree is from UT.
Okay. Well, as a kid, were you a movie person?
It's funny. As a kid, I would say I was a movie person in the sense that it was something my family loved to do. We loved to go to the movies, and my my family was a little bit more of kind of like the blockbuster, big hit movie family.
Fair
So
enough.
we were around a lot of megaplexes. So those were the types of films that I saw as a kid. But as I got older, and obviously, being in a relationship with the guy I ultimately married, I became much more into the independent art house scene, and yeah, it just kind of opened my eyes. So it was a little bit later in life that I got turned on to the beauty of independent cinema, but when I did, I was hooked.
Okay, so we should definitely illuminate exactly how we know each other. I worked for your husband, Nicholas Gonda, and I first encountered you when you were an actress in a movie I was editing.
Right.
Yeah, you were. Although we had to cut around your face so much significantly because of the character you played,
Yes.
or the spirit
There's
of it, I guess.
exactly. There's some interesting things about that character. No, and to add a little more background to that, I am not an actress at all, and that was my one and only time acting. I kind of threw in the towel after that. No, it was a great
Go
experience,
out
and I
on a
loved it.
high.
Yeah, exactly. I was already on a high note. So yeah. So no, it was a one time thing that ultimately led to so many other
Were you
amazing
hired as
things
a
in my life.
dancer?
I was hired, so they came into the studios. I was dancing with Ballet Austin at the time, and they came into the studios looking for ballet dancers to audition for a certain part. And they asked a handful of us to audition, and I was like, oh, why not? New experience. I'll just audition, and ended up getting the part and meeting the love of my life. And that was it. That
When
was history.
when
So
did you meet Nick?
um, I met Nick pretty quickly. So I met him. He was the one who ran the auditions, and so I met him during the auditions. And he was always so incredibly professional. And uh, he would be embarrassed if I said this, but I truly fell in love with him the minute I saw him.
Oh,
And so yeah, I always thought he was just a very handsome, very respectful guy, which he is.
which I second that too.
And yeah, so the love kind of blossomed over quite a few months of test shoots and early mornings and Austin and yeah,
It's
it
funny
was.
because AJ Edwards was on an earlier episode, and we talked about on there about him and Nick's casting search and audition process too on there.
Yeah, that was pretty nuts. Them waking up at like 3 a.m. to drive to these really small towns in Texas. It's pretty bananas. I remember those days.
Were there any like when you're little, like I remember when my nieces she had a period where she started getting into dancing, and I made sure to show her like Red Shoes or something like that. Were there any dancing movies that you
Sure.
were, or anything like that complemented each other, overlapped?
Yeah, I mean, one that was a little more risque, but I really loved it growing up, was All That Jazz.
Okay.
That was a very popular one for me. White Nights was also an amazing one with
I don't know White Knights.
it's with Baryshnikov and
Oh,
Gregory Hines. So Gregory Hines is like a legendary. He was a legendary tap dancer. And obviously Baryshnikov is the famous Russian ballerino, and it was, oh gosh, I think it was done in like, I want to say it was done in like the 70s or 80s.
okay.
But really great film.
I
Those were two of my favorites.
I just finally got around last week to seeing Coppola just released the Cotton Club encore where they put in a bunch more
Yeah.
stuff and it was mostly Gregory Hines they put back in. It's a lot of dance sequences that
Oh, that's amazing.
they cut them out because they were like don't forward the plot, but they put them back
Yeah.
in. You should check it out. You should.
Oh, I definitely will. That's a gem right there. Another one was A Turning Point. Um, and I'm blanking out on who was in it, but that was a ballet film that I watched that film over and over and over again when I was a kid. So I would say those were my top three.
Okay.
And then of course, as you know, when Center Stage came out, every single dancer saw that movie, and we made fun of it, but also loved it at the same time.
Did you see
So
the Altman movie, The Company?
no, I didn't see it.
It's a good dancers movie. What's cool is
Yeah,
it's Altman, so it's relatively plotless, but like
totally.
it's definitely a showcase of dancers. But
Oh, I'll
um,
have to watch it.
I should go ahead and ask you to clarify what exactly is your job title, your full title.
Currently,
Yes, currently, or your
I
best one.
right. I am the senior manager of research and education for Sundance Institute. And I primarily work with the creative producing program within the Institute.
Okay, so what does that entail?
When I find out, I'll let you know. No, it's a really cool title because I get to work on a lot of different initiatives within the Institute, and I'm also very fortunate that I can kind of work across the different programs that the Institute has. The Institute has so many different departments, not only their documentary program and their feature program. But they have Episodic and New Frontier, which is their emerging media program, their Indigenous program. There's a ton of different programs that I'm kind of able to work alongside and work with throughout the year. So basically what I do is I oversee a lot of the research that's going on within the Institute, and right now we're really focused on researching kind of the marketplace and what's going on, and finding sustainable pathways for our creators. So that's what most of the research that I'm involved in kind of centers around.
Okay.
And then in terms of education, I also help a lot with educational materials that we're creating for our content creators, as well as I sit on the digital team, and we just created, there's a digital platform that was launched not too long ago called Collab, where we do a ton of educational content for creators. And there's a free portion of that, and then there's also kind of like paid courses that we run on the platform as well.
Where's that at, Colab?
So it's just collab, so collab.sundance.org.
Okay.
And anybody can check it out.
What kind of free content's on there?
We have a ton of videos. So we have a lot of videos from our archives, but we also do custom content for the site as well. So we've interviewed directors, producers, editors, cinematographers, talking about their process, how they got into the business, their inspiration behind their work. It really kind of runs the gamut.
Okay.
And yeah, we also do some partner content. Like we just did a couple of videos with Studio Binder that are up on there too. We have resources, an entire resources page. So that's kind of curated from sites that we love, in addition to resources that we've written, like how to apply for grants, how to apply for the festival, things of that nature. And then we also list a ton of events from our partners, and then just other events in the field that we think are important for people to know about, as well as opportunities. So you'll find a list of all of our opportunities that you can apply for through the Institute, in addition to, partner opportunities, like looking at Austin Film Society, for instance, and what they have going on.
So how long have you been at Sundance?
I have been at Sundance a little over 2 years. It will be 3 years in April.
Okay. So backtracking slightly, the reason I wanted you on here was when I made this move to the Midwest, whether or not it was conscious of people were giving me this feeling, or I was worrying about this, but I felt like there's a part of me that worried that I was making a retreat, and I still want to eventually write and direct films, but We started talking because I hit up your husband because I was like wanting to know what he thought about self distribution or just putting stuff on the internet for yourself, or because I'm wanting to get back to a place where I'm making stuff like I made in college, and especially now that I feel like I have a better technical threshold for this stuff and put out myself and actually. And you keep seeing YouTube people that seem like they're making money off their videos in short form content, and so I started asking Nick about what the future of this was, and it only exchanged a few questions where he's like, you need to talk to Jess about this, and you got on the phone with me for about a half hour, and it was one of the most illuminating, mind-blowing, inspiring like conversations where because
Thank you.
well, what's happened lately in the indies I've been working in is that you really get a sense that the formula that we used to go through, especially going through at least make a good movie, it goes to festivals, it's a meritocracy, and then it gets bought by somebody else, and then you make money for that. Because of streaming and the overwhelming amount of content out there, that model is working for less people, or like so I guess I don't know what my question is there. Well, first off, did you work on First Girl I Loved?
I didn't work on First Girl I Loved. That was right before I started with Sundance, so I can kind of jump into where I started at Sundance and
Okay.
kind of like the evolution of that, because I think that would be helpful. So when I started out, I started working with a department called the Creative Distribution Initiative. That department has since it's being reborn into like other aspects of the Institute. So a lot of that distribution work is now working under our impact engagement and advocacy program, which is, now where I do a lot of my work, and I work with the amazing Brenda Coughlin. She's our director of impact strategy, and is just incredible. So that's kind of where the distribution work lies. But when I started, we had a very specific department focused on distribution. And what you're referencing, First Girl I Love, was kind of the first kind of pilot film under our fellowship. So it wasn't technically called a fellowship at the time, but they helped that film do, our department kind of provided resources and access to consultants and helped them self-release that film. And then following that, it was a successful release.
Mm-hmm.
And so they decided to make like a full fellowship out of the program.
What were the numbers for First Girl?
Oh gosh, First Girl, I would need to go back. It's been so long. But what I can do is I can send you to put in the show notes. We actually have two pieces that the producer wrote, and it's very transparent. They break down all the numbers.
Okay. I think I might have read that at some point, I guess.
Yeah.
I remember it definitely had us, like, at the time when they were going to self distribution. I remember I think they were over the stigma, but they seemed like they were okay with it. But what were the other successes or you guys did Columbus too, or?
Columbus was definitely a success. The interesting thing about that film is, we kind of joke and say like we shot ourselves in the foot out of the gate, because that film did so well theatrically, and that's typically not what happens in the course of the landscape right now. However, the interesting thing about that film was that was the epitome of an art house, audience film. Like, they just ate that film up. There was something about it. It was, Kogonada is just like such an art house name. Even though that was his first feature, he's known for doing these visual essays of like breaking down other directors' work. And so, he kind of already had a cult following, and they were able to really tap into that. And they made over $1 million in the box office. Which was like unheard of for a film that size. So they had a really successful release. And then we also did Unrest, which was our documentary film for the first year.
Okay.
And then the three films that, the case studies will actually be releasing in either February or March of this year. We did Thunder Road, which is
That's an
And
Austin-based movie, yeah.
that is an Austin-based movie, and that case study is wild. Talk about successful, and they are they're just like go-getters and completely like the epitome of DIY. And then we had 306 Hollywood, and The Devil We Know, which are two nonfiction titles, that both had very different styles of releasing, based on what the filmmakers' goals were.
So, what is the metric usually goes into with the data or the numbers when people have to decide whether or not is if because you mentioned box office numbers, like but self distribution, what kind of numbers would people look at when they're trying to decide if they're going to self distribute or not?
Um,
Was
it's tough.
Was Columbus? Did they ever think about just going straight to the platforms, the digital platforms, or?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's always a conversation starting out with every film, right? And I think it's always, do we go theatrical or do we not? And it's a lot of money and people power, in order to get a film off the ground theatrically. So it's a heavy cost benefit analysis. Now, I wouldn't say there's like a specific number that people say we need to.
Or what metrics would they use too? Just especially if they're showing
Sure.
at a festival.
Sure. So, I think what it really boils down to is if they feel they have traction with art house audiences.
Okay.
From Kogonada's, like from Columbus's festival release, they just knew from the turnout that they were getting, on their festival run. They knew that they could have traction with art house audiences, and also just the type of film it was. It was like this very melodic, kind of slow moving, very visual, film that typically does well with art house audiences. So they started reaching out to exhibitors. They worked with Michael Tuckman, who's he's a well-known kind of independent, booker, theatrical booker in the space, and he helped them kind of suss out the different markets, that they could do well in, and so for them, something that they had to weigh more in like the middle of their release was they started getting a lot of requests, in addition to the markets that they identified starting out. They started getting a lot of requests from additional art house cinemas across the country, to screen the film. And so at that point, the cost benefit analysis that they had to do was, okay, if we add on these additional screenings, is it going to help us or hurt us in terms of, are we going to be spending more in order to like get this film out, like creating more DCPs, paying more VPFs, virtual print fees for people who are unaware of that.
That was my next question.
Yeah, so some theaters have them, some theaters don't. It's less in the art house space that, you'll have to pay VPFs, but it's still a possibility, which is basically it's like a one-time fee that you have to pay in order to screen the film in a certain theater. You'll find that, then this is something that I learned from, somebody who's been in the exhibition space for a while. I learned recently is that you'll find more of those VPF fees in kind of like the bigger megaplexes, like the AMCs and things like that. But essentially, you have all of these costs that add up very quickly in order to, put your film out theatrically. So they had to, and it's, it was like one of those things that they had to make a very quick decision. Do we expand? Do we have the money to expand? And is there a way that we can expand, thoughtfully without having to pay too many fees? So what they did is they worked with their theatrical booker to identify all of the theaters that had reached out that could play the film digitally rather than having to create more DCPs to ship out, which is like, it adds up to a really big cost. So it was those types of metrics that they were kind of basing things off of during their theatrical run.
Is it just money, or sometimes, I guess it depends on what the goal is. If you're trying to get like awards traction or long-term word of mouth, like sometimes would you want to take a hit on something so you get in more markets and get more visibility on it?
100%. So that's a really great point. I think, at the very beginning, we always ask filmmakers what their goal is. Is it to pay their investors back, that's going to be a very different release than if you're, like you're saying, if you're trying to gain awareness as an artist, or are you just trying to go for eyeballs, as many eyeballs as you possibly can. Those are three very different goals.
Yeah.
And so, your strategy and your release plan is going to look very different. So a specific example of that, the 306 Hollywood team, their goal was, this was their first feature. They're a brother and sister directing partnership, and they've worked together for years now, and have an incredible portfolio working for museums and different brands. But this was their first feature, and they really felt like they needed to use the release in order to gain artistic recognition. So for them, for their theatrical release, they kind of knew out of the gate that they were going to, not necessarily make money on it and potentially lose money on the theatrical release, but they felt very strongly that in order for them to gain the artistic awareness that they wanted in order to get future work, they felt like they needed their film to be in theaters.
I guess that was actually going to be one of my next questions, was the importance of paying back your investors short term versus building a brand so you can have a personal filmmaker brand, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess I should ask the obvious question. When you self-distribute, you're paying less people, so you're going to make more of the profit?
Depends. Yeah. I mean, I think looking at it kind of from a broad lens, yes, you're going to make, you don't have as much money going through a distribution waterfall, right? You're not having to pay a distributor. And so that alone puts more money back in your pocket for sure. But then it's just kind of looking at, how much equity you have in the film, the financing structure of the film, to really get a sense of how much money is going back into the filmmaker's pocket.
Were you familiar with the Soderbergh thing, Fingerprint? I forget, it was Fingerprint Pictures or?
I mean, I read about it a little bit, but not too familiar. I didn't really do a deep dive on it.
Well, because I know he gave it up after 2, and I didn't know if you had any insight as to why that was. I know one of the other reasons I reached out to you was because I had to get over, and especially with a lot of the indies I worked on, everyone fights for theatrical, and I wanted to get a more sense about what kind of living you can make if you gave up on that, or if you were putting out your own content online. I guess, are you experiencing a lot of, that's the big fight? People, everyone just has the dream of showing everything theatrically?
Sure. I think, and rightfully so. You pour your heart and soul, and it's such, blood, sweat, and tears into making a film. And of course it should be, it should be an aspiration for that to play theatrically. However, I think it's really important. And I think it's important for you to bring people onto your team that can kind of have, can take a step back and kind of bring it to reality. And it's important to really question whether or not you have a theatrical film. Because if you don't, you're going to lose money playing your film theatrically. It is very expensive to do a theatrical run. Even if you're not working with a theatrical booker, which sometimes those costs can really add up, paying somebody a monthly fee to book the film, even if you're doing the bookings yourself, it's still time that's being taken away from you, in addition to all of the additional costs. So we are always, we try to be really, we try to get our filmmakers to really go through the exercise of thinking whether or not they have a film that lends itself to playing theatrically, because there are different spaces that you can exhibit work now and not have to deal with all of those costs, not sink those costs. And also you have to, do you have a theatrical audience? Do you have a film that people are actually going to get off their butts in their living room and go see it in a theater, which is becoming, every single day, it's becoming harder and harder to get people to leave their places of comfort to go and see a film in a theater. So it's an important question to ask for sure.
Is there, I mean, are the what kind of numbers do people get off the platforms? Specifically just viewership numbers when they go up on the digital platforms?
Sure. So, in terms of streamers like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, like you're not going to get any data really
Really?
from those players.
I
Yeah. I
mean,
mean,
as an individual filmmaker submitting your or having your movie on there, you're just not going to get access to that.
Netflix and Hulu, no, they're not going to give you any information. If you do Amazon Video Direct, which is basically Amazon's option where you, as a filmmaker, can put it up on Amazon, and kind of like set the pricing structure. That you'll get some information through, but in terms of like if you were on Amazon's streaming platform, like if they paid you, if you're on their SVOD platform, if they paid you a licensing fee, you're really not going to get numbers on that. Those giants, all of that information is proprietary, and they don't give filmmakers access to that information.
Okay.
So, which is a bummer. And then with the iTunes, the Google Plays, the transactional video on demand platforms, you'll get kind of monthly estimates from those platforms of, purchases. So you can kind of do the math, right, of how many people have purchased or rented the film. But it really isn't that much access to information. You'll get some information out of Vimeo. Vimeo tries to give you some audience insights.
Vimeo was my next question. Yeah.
Yeah, so Vimeo, you can, and I actually need to update myself on where they're at now, but the last I saw of theirs is that they would actually give you, they could actually give you like timestamped data where it's like users dropped off at, a lot of users dropped off at this, minute mark in the film,
I was talking to a friend who's trying to get his movie to distributors or maybe not distributors or any sales agents. I forget who he was setting it out to, but he was telling me he would sit at home and he would watch when people stop watching. Like he would keep tabs on that.
Yeah.
Let's back up a little. So data is a big part of what your job entails.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
In between when you were in Tree of Life and there you were you've been coding, were you?
Yeah. So how I got into kind of looking at data for answers is so after Tree of Life, I went back to school, got my degree in sociology, did some work for nonprofits and did some community organizing work, and all throughout that work I was kind of really fascinated by the difference between having a well-crafted online presence and not. And I could tell that the organizations that I would work with that had that, really fleshed out, were more successful in terms of getting funding and getting people behind their mission. And so I wanted to be able to help people with that, help the organizations that I was working with that. And so I decided I want to learn how to code. I want to learn how to build websites. And so I did a boot camp. It was a 10-week long course where I learned how to code. And at that point I was like, I need to put this to use. I need to get a job in this space to kind of hone the craft. And so I went and worked at a digital agency and then went to a startup that kind of spun out of that digital agency. I was one of 5, kind of doing the 14-hour grind with my computer every day. And then at a certain point, I was just like, you know what? I need to get back to what I love. I need to get back to the arts. I want to help artists. So it was such a huge passion of mine. I wasn't in a place anymore in my life where I wanted to be the artist. I'd spent over 20 years of my life doing that dancing, but I still had such an extreme passion for the arts. And so I kind of just married all of my skills together in terms of knowing how to code and, kind of the community organizing work. And obviously having been an artist myself at one point in time and, found the job at Sundance. So it was kind of a perfect fit.
Well, it's fascinating to me just because I've been doing all these deep dives on data lately. It's fascinating. Data overtook oil last year as a money maker, and there's great movies about it. Recently, The Great Hack on Netflix is really fascinating. It's just fascinating that you got in on this wild frontier, but helpful for indie filmmaking. Were you telling me something you were working with someone? Was it UCLA? You guys were doing AI stuff to follow when people watch films and what they were responding to, or was it USC maybe?
Yeah, we've actually spoken with a few different people in the space, and really what it boils down to is I was keenly interested in how AI is going to affect the industry. Not so much on the creator side. That's not something that I'm well versed in. That is something that our New Frontier department is amazing at,
Okay.
emerging media and how artists are using AI as an actual art form. But what I was interested in is looking at the business side of things, because obviously, you look at the Netflixes, you look at these streaming giants that have so much power right now, and the reason they have power is because of data and because of AI. Because they're using AI in order to make predictions as to what's going to be popular on their platform. Like their entire business model centers around that. Um, so I'm really curious about how that was going to affect the space. So I started reaching out to a lot of companies that were using it. Synalytic is one that's really interesting right now.
What's
They're
that?
doing, yeah, so they're doing, and there was actually just an announcement that they've now struck a deal with Warner Brothers. But basically, it's predictive modeling
This is the thing
for
about they're going to greenlighting the films.
exactly. So what they do is, and they've been around. I've had quite a few conversations with them. They're a really interesting group, and what they started with was a platform where you could go in and put a handful of data points. Say, this is my budget range. This is the cast that I'm looking to have, and basically it would spit out these sample projections. It would talk about what you could potentially do in the box office, and what you could do on digital platforms, and then also give you kind of like it was so crazy. They would also do kind of like piracy estimates, which was also really fascinating too.
They know how
So
many people are going to pirate the just
yeah,
estimate.
and like different regions, like similar content, how has it been pirated in different regions.
Okay.
So really interesting stuff, and I was just really fascinated that this technology was out there, and being created, yet in terms of the voice of the indie creator being present in those conversations, that was lacking significantly, and it still is.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, how does an independent filmmaker? I mean, data. The whole thing is that it's how it's read in the masses amount. You get into it. So, how does an indie filmmaker use that? Even something like their own personal website or their social network presence.
Yeah, so I think, going back to the question of these platforms, the interesting thing about these platforms is, they're as good as the information they're ingesting, right? And so, they're getting a lot of information on films that are kind of like, I would say, like 10 million and up,
Oh,
but the information of like films that are like below 10 million, it's really hard because they just like don't have access to that information. And so that's kind of the interesting space we're in right now, is that yes, the technology is there, but in terms of it actually being smart on data surrounding like really independent films, it's not there yet. And so it's kind of like, where do they find the access to that information, and like how do we kind of do a better job of starting to bring independent creators into those conversations, and getting them to say, like, if I had a platform like this is how I would use it, and kind of getting them involved in the use cases and the testing of that technology. So hopefully we'll see more of that. But in terms of artists actually using data to their benefit, independent artists using data to their benefit, the data that they have access to, sure. I mean, like, I think you look at creating a website, right? And there's basic analytics on any website you create today. So you look at the Squarespaces,
this is
you
exactly what
know,
I'm using right now. Yeah.
yeah, and you can get basic information of not just who is looking at your website, but also referrals, like where they're coming from, right? Is it a post that you put in Facebook where you're getting a lot of traction? Is it, an ad that you took out on Instagram? So you
Right.
can get that information, you can get that traffic information. Is it literally a Google search that brought them to your website? So it's important to be mindful of that, and not ignore that, because then you can start to get smart with the type of marketing that you're putting behind your film. And then with social media, it's yeah, I mean, it's really important these days. It's like, let's think about it. I mean, as much as we hate it, how often are we scrolling on Instagram and we see something and we're like, oh, that could be useful or interesting. I want to see that.
I am rolling my eyes in agreement on this one. But I mean, I guess it makes sense that you don't have enough eyeballs on something, then you're not going to get as much data as the bigger majors, and inherently that's what happens with the independent films. But
yeah, can I tell you one really quick story about using data? So Jim Cummings, if you don't know him, look him up. He is the writer, director, actor, producer of Thunder Road. Him and his team. So he works at a production company, and the team is called Vanishing Angle. They are a powerhouse. They do some really creative stuff in terms of the DIY space. But one really interesting example during the Thunder Road release was when they had their South by premiere. Now, there's no way of actually looking at the data to say that this did have a direct correlation, but it seems like it did, when they knew the date of their South by premiere, like a couple days before the premiere, they basically did an ad on social media through Facebook, and they put $200 into it, and they targeted, because you can do certain targets with ads, right? And you can do like location-based targeting. And they said, we're going to target, I think it was like a 2-mile radius around Variety's offices in LA. And basically, and basically saying the film is going to be at South by, here's the premiere date, and they literally got a review in Variety.
That is smart. That is so smart.
Like getting a review in the trades at a festival like South by is damn near impossible, right? Unless you have a really, really good publicist. And they didn't even have a publicist.
It gets even weirder where sometimes like those reviewers are seeing 5 movies a day, and if you're the 5th movie, like, oh man, you're just gonna I mean, I've seen reviews of movies I've worked on at a festival where it's just the most arbitrary observation, where you could tell that guy was that reviewer was just cranky or something.
Yeah, totally. And so they got a really good review. And it's a $250,000 micro budget feature.
That's
yeah.
I know. So one of the big questions I first asked you whenever we were on the phone was, I was trying to find with personal websites and putting out your own stuff, filmmaking, if anyone had done anything similar to the way Radiohead released In Rainbows, where they did a pay what you want model. And it's tricky just because obviously you need for that to work on that same scale, you need like Christopher Nolan suddenly decides he wants to release a movie online that's pay what you want. But is there anybody that's like working at this, that's finding any success, that's done this?
None of the titles that we've worked with have done a pay what you want model. I think it's a really interesting concept. I would be really curious to see if it was successful or not. I think to your point, like, you have to have a substantial following for that to even be an option. So, I think the closest thing to that we've seen is, again, the Vanishing Angle team. They recently did a crowd equity round for their next feature, and they were able to finance, I think it was, I want to say it was like $350,000 that they were able to finance through crowd equity.
So they're able to go up a little, at least, for the next budget.
Yeah. But I mean, that was by choice, because right after Thunder Road, with the success of Thunder Road, they worked with a studio on, I can't remember what exactly the budget was, but it was, I think, significantly larger than their other budgets. I think it was over $1 million. And so they worked with the studio on a feature, and then they decided that they wanted to do another feature on their own. So that was just their decision. They're like, that's what we're going to go for. So
was this like off their mailing list, or what was this? Just the points they've gotten from Facebook and social networking stuff?
So it was primarily through mailing lists, but Jim has an insane following on social media. I think he's up to, the last time I checked, I think he was up to like 70K on Twitter.
Okay.
So, they have such a huge network to tap into. So it was primarily social media that they were running that campaign through.
Okay. I remember something you said was very, very striking to me when I was talking to you about the idea of like I remember the Amazon head Ted Hope says that he thinks filmmakers should like really start concentrating on putting out their own social network presence, so you have a metric to show investors that you can get eyeballs onto the movie. And I mentioned, well, you build a big enough brand, and mentions pay what you want. You said, if I remember correctly, you said something that someone had told you that transactional was dying or dead or something along those lines. Am I misquoting?
No, you're not misquoting. We've just seen that, in the films that we've worked on. There is a steep decline in transactional video on demand, and I think it's because, I mean, I'm sure, like with me, I like, as much as we want to kind of talk about the frustrations that these streaming giants are bringing to the industry, like I watch Netflix all the time,
Oh,
right?
sure.
And I very rarely go on to iTunes to buy a film anymore. And so, we saw like,
I was
just
literally just thinking Thunder Road is on Prime and I need to watch that.
yeah, exactly. And so our first go-to is going to be like, is it on any of the streaming platforms that I have access to? I'm going to look there first. And then, again, it's very rare when we're actually going to buy something transactionally. And so we saw a big drop off from our first films. We were seeing, I think Columbus did, and again, I wrote these case studies, and it's funny, like I write them and then sometimes the numbers just like completely escape my brain. It's like, oh, okay, all of that information is out there, so like on to the next one. But
It's data.
I think,
The whole thing of data is like actually figuring it out and finding a way
yeah.
to measure it.
And so in the case study, which again, like it's public and you can access these, and I'll send you the links so your listeners can read them. But essentially, Columbus made, I think it was a little over 100K in transactional video on demand, and then some of our films the following year, like I think it was like 25K that they were pulling in transactionally. So it's like just a 2-year difference. You see like a very steep decline.
That's just a microcosm of all independent film. That's just because the numbers go down significantly on like how much people are buying stuff for, just because of when the streamings are offering.
Yeah.
I guess I want to also talk to you a little bit about, you talked to me about transmedia, and that being like just people making stuff that interacts with your film, or just like say like you write a book based off a character, or put out a story there, or make a podcast about a certain character, or you have a social media network about that. But you said that
Sure.
was very helpful to or it might have some future implications.
Sure. I think I think that's just a really big question happening right now in the industry, right? Is like, what are the different spaces that creators can explore in order to create ancillary content to their feature length work. And so I think it's really about, how can you create like a single source of IP? So say it's a film. How can you have that film have an expansive life on multiple channels? So is it kind of creating, like for instance, somebody who did this a long time ago, it was I think it was the Lizzie Bennett Diaries. They created a website. It was a feature, and they created a website where you kind of explored her diary entries through this website, and that really like pulled people in. And they were kind of ahead of their time. But yeah, is there a way where as a creator you can kind of find a new creative outlet in a different space, and on top of being able to have a different mode of creation, also pull in new audiences and more people into your craft. And I think also what that does is it gives you a more robust content base that you can just start to build on, to pull in more people through social channels, right? And create bigger audiences and a bigger following. And so I think we'll start to see a lot more of that. When I was speaking with somebody in the AI space, which there's there's obviously a lot of people exploring AI. There's kind of a much smaller group of people who are actually exploring AI in entertainment, especially in like the film world. But when I was speaking to somebody, their prediction was that we were going to see that the future of sustainability for artists was creating ancillary content. So, content on social media, kind of looking at these. There's these apps, gosh, I can't remember the name of them, but there are a few apps out there now where you can actually create a story that will get texted to people, so people can get in on these storylines, and they're like texted throughout the day, and it's like you reading these text message chains of the characters going back and forth with one another.
I think I remember you mentioning that to me.
Yeah, and so it's things like that are starting to kind of bubble up within the industry.
Well, it seems like it's also tricky if I know the new Watchmen TV show made a big thing about filling in the gaps on the show, and that was based on the comic book. Originally had this every issue, almost all Alan stuff ends with him doing some multimedia build out the world stuff, and it seems like the trick is to find it in a way that's not craven marketing or craven
Sure.
something that actually enriches the process. Did you follow any of the I forget who was all involved, but the Grimes thing on Twitter where she was talking about AI stuff? And
no, I love Grimes. I absolutely love Grimes. But I haven't followed any of her AI conversation.
There's this artist I like who followed up on it because she just done a talk. Her name's Holly Herndon, and she talked about film music and AI being used in film music. And she wrote this long Twitter essay where she was saying it's not going to create the most amazingly original stuff, but there's definitely going to be a process where it fills in the gaps of people who just have a need. So if you have a problem licensing stuff, AI might fill in stuff like that.
Sure, yeah, like the less sexy stuff,
The elevator music commercials, I think they mentioned too. Yeah, it was definitely the boring stuff. What does all this mean to one of the things that I found fascinating, specifically with First Girl, was when they self-distributed. It was like that seems like it works, but only because that movie had done well at the Sundance that year. But what does it all these stuff mean for movies that, especially it seems like festival slots are being a little more democratically put out right now? No one's safe to get a festival slot anymore, and even then to get out there. What does it mean if you have to bypass a festival and put out or to get your name out there?
Yeah, I mean I'm not gonna lie, it's tough, right? Because festivals do play such an important role in especially in the independent film world, right? Like if you're targeting independent film lovers, there's a big community of independent film lovers that do look to certain festivals as kind of like a curatorial force, right? But I think there's still a way, and on the flip side, I think audiences are getting hungry and wanting to explore outside of curatorial forces too. I think that we have generations that are coming up that, wouldn't really even understand what that means, right? They're bombarded with content on a daily basis coming from a lot of different channels, and they're just going to latch onto something that they think is interesting to them. They could care less whether or not it has a stamp of approval on it. So I think it's really important for creators to, find their communities, right? And so, I think we saw a movement kind of looking at like the micro of like how do you like mass market a film. And now I think what we're going to see, which we already are starting to see, is like it's not about like you're not going to find traction and like just trying to get it out in front of as many people all at once. It's like really focusing on the specific communities that are going to be interested in this work, right? So is it like a certain regional community that's going to be interested in your work based on the themes that are present in the film? Or is it like a certain interest community.
I know one of the big questions I had for you initially was about the short-term looks versus the long-term looks, and how you can try to find ways of like, because the film industries, I feel, is always stupidly based on, especially in the last 30, 40 years, the first weekend box office, and that is just for the shelf life of a movie. That's a ridiculous measurement. That's a ridiculous measurement.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's, and I hate using this term. I know we all kind of cringe when we hear it, but it is about building a brand around yourself as an artist, right? And
Yeah.
so I know, and that's like another one of those like eye rolls in
No,
a
no.
brand.
What's worse
But
is I have it in my notes to ask you about building a brand, which it's absolutely an eye roll. It's absolutely an eye roll.
yeah, well, listen, I know, like, again, I'm not a filmmaker. I have an insane amount of respect for filmmakers and what they go through to put their art out there. It's a relentless job. And so I get it. I mean, I get that at the end of the day, sometimes the last thing you want to do is turn to social media to kind of build a presence. But it's just, it's the nature of things now. And we live in the digital space. And so, you've got to figure out what your digital stamp is. Maybe it's, maybe it's not like the traditional, building a brand on Instagram, right? Maybe it's you're a really thoughtful writer and you want to build a brand on Medium by releasing a ton of essays that have to do with your work or things that are tangentially related to your work. You can think outside the box when it comes to a digital presence, but we are inherently a digital society now. So,
well, especially as like the digital forms migrate to other things. Like when I was in New York, everyone talked about TikTok. Everyone talked about TikTok. One of my friends even flat out said he thought if if Godard was a teenager right now, he'd be on TikTok, is what he said.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
so I guess what I know basically when I've had this conversation with a lot of directors, specifically our mutual friend Tyler Savage. We had this talk a lot about we started falling in love with movies in the '90s and independent film, and there gave us this false model of what success was like. It's like we believe very thoroughly in the meritocracy, but we also just like you make a good movie, it gets bought by a festival, then you have a career from there. And I know, like, I went down that path briefly because I especially followed specifically the Kevin Smith model, where I maxed out my credit cards, only I didn't finish the movie, and so like that I keep having the example of this model dying out on me, especially with like movies I worked on that got to a festival, and you're like, oh, that should happen, and then it didn't. I guess, what do you foresee the immediate future for indie filmmakers? Is it just going to be that the window is narrowing more and more specifically for slots that break out? Do you think there's going to be a potential for a movie, internet-only phenomenon movie, a feature even potentially?
God.
It's a simple question. It's a simple question.
Super simple. No, I think that's a question that everybody's asking them, and I think it's an even bigger question in terms of what's going to happen in the marketplace with the consolidation of media giants, with the power that the streamers have, with the changing business models. There's a lot of kind of the equilibrium it's out of whack, and there's a lot of things that are in flux right now. Which I think is yes, it can be scary, but also, in any industry, when it reaches a point like this, there's opportunity for growth and there's opportunity for things to change. And so I think we're up on that moment right now. And it's hard to say. It's hard to say which direction it's going to go in. But, I think independent, filmmakers and independent content creators have to have hope. And I think that it starts by just making whatever you can with the least overhead, if that makes sense.
No,
it's like
that's exactly where my headspace is at right now too.
Yeah. It's like, what resources do you have access to, and what quality content can you create for the least amount, right? So again, I think, you look at these models like Thunder Road, where they were very modest with their budget. They were like 250,000. That's what we have. That's what we're going to make this film for. And I know that there's also some ethical questions about working in the micro budget space, because you're asking for a lot of favors, right? But it's like it's a giving, it's like, it's a giving culture, right? Because you expect, or I would hope, I think a lot of filmmakers think this, it's like you ask for somebody to do something on your film and you expect them to ask you to do something, right? It's kind of like a bartering society.
So transactional isn't dead after all.
Transactional is not dead in that sense. Absolutely not. But yeah, to that point, I think it's, just not looking to gatekeepers to give you the permission to make something, and also exploring different media landscapes, and seeing, where you can create content that helps you build an audience.
I know when I'm in my most positive moods, I think I like to think back on where we were cinematically 100 years ago, and you read all these stories about like why the studios formed. Like I want to say it was Louis B. Mayer first got in because he bought the regional rights to Birth of a Nation. Like he owned the rights to show it just in New England or something like that. And it was so Wild West then. And my hope is that instead of backward looking about why it wasn't like it was in the 90s, we can look forward Wild Wild West style. Last question. So are you going to Sundance?
I am. I will be there. And if anybody wants to reach out, please do. I will be there I will be there Thursday, and through the first weekend, and I'm leaving Tuesday. So if you're there, hit me up and we can talk about data.
Are you on the Instagram, Twitter, or what's
social
the best
media channels?
Which was the best way to contact you?
Listen, I have a confession to make, and that is I do not practice what I preach. But
power to you.
On the flip side, like I said, I am not a filmmaker, so I am not looking to create that brand. No, but I do need to be better about it. I do need to practice what I preach. But I am at Crimson Vinyl on Twitter and Instagram, and then also.
I thought your Instagram was private, actually.
My Instagram is private, but if you send me a follow request and you say, hey, heard you on this podcast, maybe I'll give you access. We'll see. But Twitter is probably the better way to reach out to me, honestly.
Okay.
And then I also answer the creative distribution at sundance.org email address. Okay. So I would say if you have any distribution, marketing, data-driven questions, the best way to get a hold of me is through that email address.
Do you want to say anything about the is it the Sundance Fellowship?
I wish I could, but we no longer offer it.
Oh,
so,
okay. I went down a dive of reading some articles about that, but I guess not.
Yeah, we'll catch up on that, you and me.
Okay.
But yeah, we used to offer a creative distribution fellowship, which was basically us giving a grant and access to resources for filmmakers to self-release their work. But that is on hiatus at the moment.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, on that positive note.
Here's a resource if anybody has questions. I really do love hearing from people, so please reach out.
Okay, Jess Fuselier, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Shane, and hopefully I'll get to see you soon. Let's have a beer sometime.